Hello, I'm Grant. Welcome to Second Plate, a show all about reusing ingredients and using staples that you already have in your kitchen. So the last night on Second Plate, we made some egg noodles that are all entirely from scratch, cut to be some pretty thick. So I wanted to make something with a sauce. So tonight I'm going to be making beef stroganoff so that the natural sauce that the stroganoff makes can be absorbed by those noodles. And it's pretty tasty and not too hard at all. You can obviously actually sub store-bought noodles, but I really recommend doing the homemade ones. It really lets the awesome sauce of the stroganoff just mean so much more. So what I have already cut up here is I have some mushrooms and onions, and I have some parsley as well. And I wanted to talk about this particularly because it's something where before the show, I would never use a lot of herbs. And I've noticed a lot that they actually add a lot more than I had previously thought, because on one hand, you just smell them, and that's just a big deal. Like, it's awesome. I always had heard like parsley was just for garnishing, but really it does add some taste. So I'd recommend it, and I wanted to call that out specifically because I know I personally just never used it, and as I used it more and more, it's like, oh, I totally get it. In particular, I'm going to be using it for two reasons in this dish. Is one, it helps with the flavor, but two, I've really noticed over the past several recipes like how much just having a little green in an otherwise brown looking recipe, because stroganoff, you kind of cook it all together in one pot, so it makes sense that everything looks the same way. So this will give it color. And that's why what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be separating it into two halves of my recipe. The first one will be sautéed with the rest of my veggies, but the second half I'm actually going to save until the very end, because once it's sautéed and cooked, you lose the greenness. And I'm going to add that second half at the end of the dish once we're serving it to add that back in. But I still want some cooked in it because I still want the flavor. So just going through, walking the blade. Generally I start by, again, just cutting off the stems. I roll it so you can get some nice chunks, just go down, and then I just plant it, and I just kind of slowly walk this forward. The more you practice it, the faster it goes. And I'll be honest, out of all the knife skills I've learned, this is just fun. Because if you're doing it properly, you can't cut yourself. So you really can start going like faster and faster. Cool. So I'm just going to go take this aside. Get my bowls. I personally do a lot of dishes as I cook. And because of that, I use a lot of dishes. That's a trend I've totally noticed with my own cooking, is just I use a lot of dishes. So feel free to, if you were making this at home, to actually stop and set for a second, clean off the cutting board, clean the knife. That's, I feel like, is the real secret to staying ahead on dishes. Okay, I'm going to next saute these. I'm going to put about 2 tablespoons of oil, a little bit more, a little bit less. It's not a big deal. And then I'm going to add my onions, mushrooms, and then again half of the parsley. Every time I make these, I try to experiment a little bit on different things. So for this one, I actually went for stockier, larger mushrooms, but less beef. I'm gonna add these in. And I'm no expert in this, but these are called, the herbs are like aromatics, and this is, I'm pretty sure, where you get that name, because as you saute them, particularly if you have any garlic or shallots, you really do start to smell. Okay. I'm going to turn this up a little bit. And I'm no master at sauteing. What I'm trying to do is make sure I have enough olive oil to thinly coat everything. That's what lets it sear and fry, just the outside layer. So I'm going to add a little more in. So that's really why I'm moving it around like this, is just to make sure there's a little bit of oil on everything, so that as it sits on my little skillet here, it will quickly fry up. This is really also that what won me over for garlic, is when I began sauteing it, that's when I really started noticing it. Next is I just have some Worcestershire. This is just a personal favorite. I used this on one of the earlier dishes for the show. And honestly, I don't know how to best describe Worcestershire, but anytime I use mushrooms, I'm like, oh, can I get some Worcestershire in there? While I have this all going, I have my beef broth just kind of heating up over here. So that is ready. When I make this at home, I'll actually do it all in one single pan. So I would just use a pot similar to this one over here on my left, and I would saute in that stainless steel pan so I could add everything. However, what's annoying about that though then is when you add the broth at the end, because it's all in one pan, that's when the temperature drops greatly because the broth's not boiling and you're adding a ton of mass. So that's just something to kind of call out where you can choose. Do you want the convenience of one pan, or do you want the shorter cook time? I also like how with the other pans I can usually have a handle right here. That makes sauteing so much easier. So again, I'm just trying to move this around. When you see me do the circular motion, I'm just kind of getting them to turn, get it to one side, do like a little flip. If you want to get super fancy, you can do it entirely like that. But really, you don't have to. You can, if you need to get in there with like say a spatula like this, because often, since I'm no expert, there's always going to be like that one mushroom that just, it's not exactly sticking to the pan, but refuses to let go. So I just like to kind of get in close and just be like, okay, move everything around, make sure it's good. Cool. I'm going to not fully cook these either. Like generally I'd heard with mushrooms, the way you tell they're done is they will begin to sweat and they'll give up their water. And you want to cook that out and then cook it off. And that's how you're done. However, you have to keep in mind that with everything in this recipe, it's all going to eventually be cooked even more in this big pot. So I don't want to overcook it. In particular with the hamburger that I'm doing next, that's important so it doesn't get spongy. Cool. I'm going to purposely leave some stuff in there as I pull my little veggie mixture off and away. I'm going to set this aside and re-add some olive oil as we're going to now brown the beef. And this is just ground beef. However, I will specifically say that I got very lean beef. I think this is 93% to 7% fat. And that just gives you a lot less runoff and fat. If you like heavier cuts of beef, then feel free. But it is not required. And I think that's important because I, again, used to not worry at all about the amount of fat in my beef. But it really matters in ways that you wouldn't expect. Like the big tip that really made my burgers better is you want a fair amount of fat in burgers. Otherwise, they just won't hold together. So they can taste perfectly fine, but they just won't hold together. So I'm going to cook these down, brown it. Just browning beef is pretty easy, so not much to say there. I do want to leave it potentially with a little bit of pink because if you brown it entirely, then it's going to get spongy once it cooks in there. Got some seasoning, salt, pepper. Very important. It's simple, but it really does matter, particularly I think the salt, where if you don't season it, you just instantly know. But it's weird because if you've ever had under-seasoned food, you would never say like, oh, this needs salt. Like it doesn't taste like it needs a salty flavor. It affects it in ways that aren't always clear. Okay. Getting these down pretty good. Again, this is basically the same action as sauteing where I'm just getting it all nice and brown, again cutting up the red. I know one thing I'd love to explore on a future show is just all kinds of different meat cuts and like say the fats and how they affect dishes, because I think it's super interesting and you can get very into that. And knowing that difference, I'm sure, really affects the difference of the dish, but you would never think of that necessarily. Cool. Looks like we get a couple chunks. Again, it's okay there's a little bit of pink because I'm not going to be serving this straight as is. And if it's too overcooked, it becomes spongy, and that's not exactly what I'm going for, because you just got to keep in mind that there's going to be more done to it. Like, no one really wants to have spongy hamburger, because essentially if you leave this in too long and then go in there, you're steaming it, and steamed ground beef is not something I would like to serve. Cool. Looking overall pretty good. Just gotta make sure I get everything out. And you'll notice how if I had really high fat content meat, there would be so much more oil. And that's how you really get that steamness to it. So I'd recommend pretty lean hamburger for this. It's something that I hadn't thought of, but as I was going through doing research for this recipe, I could tell the ones that were better liked kind of all called that out. All right, looking about done there. Okay. So while this is still hot, I'm going to re-add some of my veggies, just so they can mix in there. All right, looks pretty good. And then I'm going to add this to the beef broth and talk a little bit about the other ingredients I want to have in there. So we have beef broth. Normally I would actually add this straight to my singular pot. I don't want it necessarily boiling, but it's nice if it's already pretty hot. So I'm just going to carefully add this in. And get this going again. So ideally, I want to have enough beef broth to cover everything, but I am going to be letting this simmer down so it has less in it. But this is something where when you do the one singular pan recipe, it's very easy to call at the end. Otherwise, you just kind of have to guess as you go. So another thing I want to call out then is I have just some simple cornstarch. I'm going to be adding this to help create the sauce. This is something where I've spoken on a previous episode that you often, when you make sauces, you add flour. And this is something where you can also add alternatively. Cornstarch you often would add to, say, gravy instead, because it gets a lot thicker than flour would and has a little bit more flavor to it. It has a flavor, whereas I would say flour really doesn't. So I'm going to add this to help thicken it, because what I think of with beef stroganoff is it developing this gooey sauce that ties everything together. And it comes from basically boiling and cooking the dish all together, like almost like a stew. Like you can actually even make this in more of a like a pressure cooker or a long-term thing, but I like the singular pan here. So I'm just going to get a fair amount in. Again, I'm huge on the moment about recipes that you can just figure out as you go. You don't have to know exactly. So if you want it, you can probably add more early on, or you can just let it simmer longer. It really, if you're just trying to find a good sweet spot where everything in here isn't overdone, but you still have the thick sauce that you want. Just kind of keep stirring to agitate this. I want to break down those clumps of cornmeal. And you can see how you can still see the parsley in here, but it's a lot less pronounced than the really fresh green one. So then I would say, honestly, like I'm going to be putting this on at the end, but I would say save the parsley until you literally serve the dish. Okay. And I'll just keep kind of agitating that as it goes. Cool. I'm essentially just going to be bringing this to a nice little, maybe not a full rolling boil, but it's a simmer. You basically want it to slowly lose more of its liquid so the sauce gets thicker and thicker. It's something I would just kind of work out as you go. You just kind of have to watch it, but it's not too involved. Also, I'm just going to add some sour cream, adds just kind of a nice little flavor to it. Just a little dot. Have that kind of melt away in there. Here we go. I've definitely been going more towards I don't know if this is probably the best way to describe it, but a soupier stroganoff, because I found I really like when I can serve these in bowls. It's just warm and it's nice. You can have it if you like a really thick sauce, so you can have it on a plate, but I've kind of liked just the collective warmth of it. Like as I've just tried this, it seems like this would be so nice to have on, say, a winter night where you can just hold this warm bowl of stroganoff and it just warms you just from having it in your hand. And I've seen some recipes, what they'll do with the cornmeal instead is you can pre-mix that with the beef broth and let that sit so that you can whisk it and break up any lumps. But it can go either way. I would say if you probably have a lot of cornmeal starch, I would probably definitely do that approach just because it's a little bit easier when it's not in the pot. But often I'm just waiting for this to heat up, so I don't mind just kind of stirring it. Cool. And at this point, all the beef should be cooked, so don't feel bad if you have to just honestly taste it. Like that's something I've been like really doing lately, is just like, you know what, I'm just going to get a spoon, I'll just set that aside with something on it, and I'll just give it 2 minutes and just taste it. Just constantly like just taste it. So while this is beginning to simmer, the next thing I want to do is add my noodles. So these were just made on a previous show and will kind of really absorb all the sauce. These are just egg noodles. I purposely cut them to be fairly thick. I wanted to have them out to stand because I just made these. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just section these off. I'll actually often just separate them because as I want to go through and stir all of these have a tendency to get caught. And what I've gone is I want them to become more of like a, I don't know, almost like a dumpling or something. So I'll probably actually section these off, but it's something where I usually wait till the end so I can see. And the extra little flour will also help thicken up the recipe a little bit. So I'm just going to go add these to our stroganoff. And I found, like, I'm sure I've said this so many times on the other episode, but this sauce of the stroganoff's really nice. And having like these thick noodles instead of, say, a small spirally noodle that I think you would buy, it just lets them absorb all of that. And it makes the dish more of a entree than a soup, if that makes sense. This is the webbing that kind of holds all of the dish together. So add all of these. If I have extra noodles, I can just freeze them, but I think it's important to make sure I have enough where it can absorb everything, because I don't want it to be soup. I want it to be stroganoff. Cool. So as those go in, we can start to see it's getting less and less of this broth. And generally I would let this simmer. I'm going to let this simmer pretty long because I want all this excess broth to boil off and we can get something nice and thick. You'll notice I just kind of cut down these noodles. I've been going like thinner and thinner. I made a recipe back in high school actually one time where you make the noodles and you grate them, so you end up with these little tiny ones. I'm thinking that might actually be better, but I haven't yet tried it. I'm thinking maybe next time that's more of what I'll go for. So I'm just going to put this on, just slightly ajar, and let this cook down as the eggs the eggs in the noodles get cooked all the way through, the sauce should start to build and form, and then we're going to serve it in a bowl. All right, so this has been simmering for a good amount of time. I added a little bit more cornmeal to help it thicken up a little bit. This is something where you will want to get it however you personally want it. Since I make my noodles a little bit thicker, it's a little bit harder to have them, say, be exactly al dente or something. I'm really just going for more of a dumpling. And it's, at this point, I'm not even sure if I can call them noodles, but I found it really just works. Well, it will just soak in that sauce while they cook, and honestly, the noodles become the better part. But I just have some paprika. I'll be honest, I've never used paprika before this recipe, and I don't think it has a very pronounced flavor, but it was something that is apparently a big deal in stroganoff. So I'm just gonna add a fair bit. I was surprised to know how red it is, but I'm just gonna dump that in. If I was cooking at home, if I had a, say, spice that I really didn't know what it was or how it tasted, I would just basically make one version of that recipe and I would just dump a ton in, because that's a great way to learn. Like, if you want to see how salt affects your food, just dump a ton of salt in. Now, don't go crazy, but just make, say, a couple batches. Like, hey, here's no salt on my hamburger. Here's what I think is half. Here's full. Here's double. And then you'll probably be right where, like, okay, I get what it's supposed to be. Cool. Got that. I'm going to add about half of the remaining parsley to kind of green this up, and then have still some in reserve to add later on. Because you can pretty much not see any of the previous amount of parsley that was in there, but the flavor's there. That's really what matters. The rest is just mainly for the extra looks. It makes it interesting. Cool. Then I'm just going to just ladle this up. It's interesting how, looking at this now, how it must have been affected by the less beef I used. And I think how that contributes to the dish is just kind of interesting. Like, I added more cornstarch while it simmered to help thicken it up a little bit more. But I think really I would go back and add more beef in. I guess I was just really afraid that it was going to be heavily dominated by beef, and I wanted it to be a really focus on the noodles. It's interesting because I thought, as I was making this dish at the start, I was like, wow, there's just so much veggies, and I actually didn't put all the ones I had in. But now that I see that they're cooked down, it's a lot less pronounced, and I thought, you know what, I really should have dumped in all my veggies, because the noodles added a fair amount of mass that I didn't expect. But all right, we have our stroganoff right here. I just have some more of the parsley, so I'm just going to add this right there. I just like the green. It's nice. One thing I would love to serve this with is just some bread, because again, the thing that makes it for me is just the sauce. And this seems like it'd be so perfect where if I'm making the noodles anyway, I could easily split half of that off to make bread flour instead, not bread flour, bread dough. Cook that alongside it, and that way when you're done with all your noodles, you can easily just wipe around the bowl with your bread and just draw everything in and get some nice flavor. So we have our completed stroganoff. It's a pretty easy recipe. When I sit down and do it on the show, it sounds like, oh, it's got all these steps, but really, it's a great thing you can make all in one pan. You can easily substitute in store-bought noodles instead of homemade, but I heavily recommend making your homemade ones where you can just dial it in to be the thing that you want. Like, if you want to instead have the more classical thin spiral noodles, totally go that. It's your stroganoff, it's your dish, and you can have a lot of fun with it. If you don't like parsley, or if you instead prefer just a really ground beef heavy stroganoff, go for that. It's just like a nice comfort recipe where it's not too far off from something I would make normally, but it's got a little bit extra something. And honestly, I've been in a huge like parsley mood lately, and I just think it looks so nice on this to have like that nice little piece of green and then just to juxtapose the brown. So what I would generally use out of the ingredients from this and on future episodes is the mushrooms can go in so many things. Parsley, I would actually love to try those noodles in other things because the noodles just work for just so many things. I often have leftovers, but this is something where I could easily see myself actually making on a night just for myself because it reheats very easily. A lot of the ingredients are things you can use in other things. Like I think ground beef is pretty flexible. You can pretty much use it in so many recipes. But it's something I think I'll definitely be making a lot now that I've actually had to go out and learn it for the show. So thanks for watching, and next time on Second Plate we're going to be taking these ingredients and reusing them in a couple different ways to make an entirely different dish, but not have to let these go to waste or constantly make the same thing.